Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving into a deeply fascinating part of human nature. We're going to unpack exactly why we are all so intensely obsessed with our family names, our roots, and our ancestry. And honestly, the most interesting part of this whole mystery, it actually starts right inside your own wallet.
You know the drill nowadays. You can easily order a kit online, spit in a tube, or send off a quick DNA swab, and a few weeks later, boom, you get back a brightly colored chart exactly like this one, breaking down your genetic origins with absolutely stunning precision. You might look at it and discover, wow, I'm 70% English, 17% Scandinavian, maybe 6% North African, along with a mix of other global regions. Millions of people are eagerly paying for these services right now. But we really have to ask ourselves, why? Why does it actually matter to your daily life if you're a quarter Kazakh, a quarter Japanese, or a quarter Mexican? What is it we're actually searching for?
So, to truly understand this obsession, here's our roadmap for today. We'll start with the family tree obsession, move into the invention of surnames, then look at the psychological motives for searching, explore the crisis of identity, and finally, wrap up with the past and the future.
All right, let's jump right into part 1, the family tree obsession. Seriously, think about this for a second. Have you ever pulled out your bank card or your ID, stared at the family name printed right there, and truly wondered who the original owner of that name was? If your last name is the Carpenter or the Smith or the Happy One, it's completely natural to wonder if your great-great-grandfather actually built tables, forged iron, or, just smiled a lot. Were these names descriptive? Were they literal? It's this exact curiosity that is currently driving millions of people to genealogy websites, typing in their national ID numbers and surnames, hoping to uncover some grand family saga. But turns out there's a bit of a harsh historical truth behind these names. The political scientist James Scott has this brilliant concept called seeing like a state. And he explains that our fixed surnames, they aren't actually these ancient romantic family traditions we want them to be. They are, in fact, highly modern bureaucratic inventions. Historically, a state just couldn't function if it couldn't easily identify its citizens. Governments needed a standardized, legible system to manage property, collect taxes efficiently, and, crucially, draft young men into the military. And to pull all of that off, they literally needed to pin you and your family down to a single, easily traceable label.
Which brings us nicely to part 2, the invention of surnames.
Think about how this evolved over time. For centuries, right up until the late 14th century, having just a first name was usually more than enough. If you lived in a tiny village and your name was James, everyone just knew you were James, the son of the local baker. You didn't need a surname because your world was small. But as populations exploded, things had to change. By the 15th century, cities like Florence realized, hey, we can't run a proper census without adding detailed lineage and nicknames. Fast forward to the 17th and 18th centuries, and massive European state bureaucracies officially standardized surnames just to keep track of land and taxes. Later, this exact system was aggressively exported globally, like in 1882, when the Algerian civil status law legally mandated fixed surnames for the entire population. So here is the wild contrast at play. On one side, you've got the state's perspective. To them, a surname is purely a tool for control, taxation, property tracking, and military conscription. It's basically an administrative barcode. But on the flip side, we have the individual's perspective. For us, that exact same name represents our roots, our ancestry, deep psychological meaning, and this profound sense of belonging. The state created the label for paperwork, sure, but we infused it with our soul. However, we have to acknowledge that the historical rollout of these names was often cold, arbitrary, and sometimes outright cruel. When colonial powers stepped in to impose these systems, they prioritized their own convenience above all else. In the Philippines, Spanish colonizers literally handed local officers pages of a Spanish dictionary, assigning surnames alphabetically by district just to get the job done quickly. Meanwhile, in Algeria, French authorities sometimes used this mandatory naming process to actively demean the local population, arbitrarily assigning them humiliating animal names or insulting physical descriptions. It's a pretty stark reminder of the raw power dynamics hiding behind the names we carry around today.
Let's shift gears and look at part 3, psychological motives for searching.
Why are we so desperate to look back? Well, clinical psychologists who study genealogy have identified 3 primary drivers that actively push us to search for our ancestors, especially in our fast-paced, often isolating modern world. These are the pursuit of connection, the compensation for loss, and the need to reframe our identity. Let's break those down.
The very first step, connection, is fundamentally about curing modern loneliness. Think about it.
Today, our nuclear families are pretty small, and we move around a lot, leaving many of us feeling disconnected from a broader community. Searching for our roots creates a tangible bridge to the wider world. We see this all the time on shows like the BBC's Who Do You Think You Are? When celebrities discover these hidden, shocking truths, like finding out a grandmother traveled alone on a boat from India or ancestors who survived historical tragedies in Eastern Europe, it completely changes their worldview. They suddenly realize their solitary modern life is actually the result of an epic, sprawling global history. It cures that isolation.
Then there's the second driver, compensating for a feeling of loss or deficit. Impartially speaking, this takes a lot of forms depending on the culture. Sometimes it's super practical, people literally looking for a lost financial inheritance. But other times, it's about desiring social prestige to compensate for feeling a bit insignificant in your everyday life. For instance, some folks dedicate years trying to prove a noble lineage or tying their bloodline back to revered historical figures, like claiming descent from the Prophet Muhammad. Psychology views this objectively as a search for spiritual consolation. It's a way for someone to say, hey, my day-to-day life might be a struggle, but my core, my origin, is deeply significant.
Okay, moving to part 4, the crisis of identity. The renowned psychoanalyst Erik Erikson noted that throughout our lives, we hit different psychological roadblocks. And in midlife, we face a major crisis between generativity, which is that feeling of actually producing value, creating and giving back, versus stagnation, which is that creeping feeling of decline, apathy, and wondering, did I make all the wrong choices? Discovering our roots can actually be an incredibly powerful tool to help rewrite a disappointing life story into something much more meaningful. Let me give you a great example of how this plays out. Imagine someone who dreamt of being a writer when they were young, but because of intense family pressure, they ended up in medical school and lived their whole life as a somewhat reluctant doctor. They hit their 60s feeling totally alienated from their own life. But then they dive into their family tree and discover, wow, their great-grandfather was a heroic wartime medic during World War II. Suddenly, their entire perspective shifts. That mundane medical career is instantly reframed. It's no longer a personal failure. It becomes this profound inherited destiny. That genealogical discovery literally cures their identity crisis. But we do have to objectively ask a pretty provocative question here. What happens when the DNA results don't give you that heroic narrative you were hoping for? What happens when the biological truth directly contradicts deeply held, sometimes very exclusive beliefs? For example, how does an extreme right-winger in Europe react to discovering they actually have North African or Arab DNA? Or how does a strict nationalist who prides themselves on pure indigenous roots react to finding out their ancestors were actually recent immigrants? The search for identity can sometimes completely shatter the foundation a person has built their life upon, revealing that the purity they claimed was just a myth all along.
And finally, let's wrap this up with part 5, the past and the future.
This relentless search for our family trees really hits the nail on the head regarding a massive tension in the modern world. Today, the individual is everything. You're expected to carve your own path, find your own success, and generate your self-worth entirely on your own. But honestly, that is exhausting. Deep down, humans still desperately crave the security, the warmth, and the unearned belonging of the ancient family collective. Searching our genealogy is basically our modern coping mechanism. It's how we try to balance our fierce individualism with our primal, deep-seated need to belong to something far older and larger than ourselves. This brings us to a fascinating way to look at our relationship with time itself. The German historian Reinhard Koselleck, in his book Futures Past, wrote this amazing line: "Every present was once someone else's anticipated future." I love this quote because it completely flips the perspective. When we look at a family tree, we usually think we are just looking backward at them. But Koselleck reminds us that while they were alive, they were actively looking forward. They were imagining us. So I want to leave you with this thought to end our explainer today. When your ancestors were out there toiling in the past, laboring in fields, surviving wars, or migrating across oceans in unimaginable hardship, what kind of future were they dreaming of? It is highly likely that the simple privileges, the safety, and the basic opportunities of your present life are the exact future they were desperately dreaming of just to survive their darkest days. You aren't just the endpoint of their biology, you are the living manifestation of their highest hopes. Thanks for joining me on this journey, and I really hope this changes how you look at that name printed in your wallet.